about one book which I've just read, which is A Heart That Works by Rob Delaney. And I want to tell you about it because it's an absolutely fantastic read. And I feel any of you would love this book. Rob Delaney, I'm sure many of you will know, is a comedian and writer. He's written a lot for telly, and he wrote the brilliant series Catastrophe, which is absolutely hilarious and fab. Great to see some of you joining me, by the way. Lovely to see you, Amanda. I'm talking tonight about this book because I loved it and I've only just read it, and it's very much in my heart. Um, entitled A Heart That Works. It's a book all about the very, very sad story of Rob Delaney's son dying of a brain tumour. And he was only 2 when he died. And the thing is that although it is a book about deep grief and a terrible tragedy, hello, great to see you. It's so nice to have you here this evening. And this is, by the way, a slightly spontaneous session that I'm doing because it's been a very hectic day. I was going to do a different subject. I was going to talk about dentists in literature, which I thought would be rather fun. And I've got lots of other exciting sessions planned in the near future. But because it's been such a hectic day, I thought it'd be great to just focus on one book. And this is the book that I've just read, and I really loved it. And Rob Delaney is a really lovely writer. He's actually written another book which came out in 2014, which is called Mother, Wife, Sister, Human, Warrior, Falcon, Yardstick, Turban, Cabbage. And that is a selection of stories about his life. Um, Whereas this book, which has just come out, is literally out now, and I believe that Rob is on tour with the book as we speak, is a very different kind of book because it is telling the story of his son's tragic death. And we know from the very beginning that that's what it's about. But the amazing and brilliant thing about the book is that Rob manages to be hilarious even in the face of awfulness. And when I read this book, I was absolutely laughing through my tears and crying through my laughter. And I agree, it is a great title. And somehow the picture is the perfect picture as well. And it does also start off with Rob talking about wild swimming. So I'm just going to read you that little bit because it's a really great beginning of the book and it will make you want to plunge into the water yourself. I swim most days now in a pond near our home. There are ponds of various sizes scattered around London, and I'm lucky to live near enough to a couple of them that I can run or cycle a short distance and get wet in a natural body of water. My favourite pond is managed by the city, and if you attend a short briefing, give them £8 and put on an orange swim cap, they let you have it. Have at it. It's roughly 1 mile across and ringed by tower blocks and newer, shinier residential buildings. One time, a heron carrying a dead frog in its mouth flew over me as I swam. I went home and told my 4-year-old, and he started crying and told me that the frog was his friend. Had you told me even 5 years ago that I would be a habitual swimmer in a body of water that was not the ocean, I wouldn't have believed you. I grew up next to the ocean, at the beach as often as possible, or sailing around the little islands off Marblehead, Massachusetts, in a tiny little sailing boat called a widgeon. So the ocean was not a problem for me, but I've spent most of my life afraid of lakes and ponds. Frankly, I wasn't even crazy about pools. The way I intellectualized it was that if something killed me in the ocean, I would understand what had happened. There would be no mystery. My autopsy would read shark attack or run down by drunken teenager in a Boston whaler and hacked apart by engine blades. It would be awful, but anyone who read the report would understand what had happened. Whereas if I met my end in a lake or pond, that would at best mean that sentient vines had reached up from the pond floor and coiled around my thighs and waist and pulled me down, not even allowing me to scream because they tightened around my throat and crushed my larynx. Or more likely, that the gas bloated zombie corpse of a murdered postman had slipped a rusty handcuff round my ankle and was going to yank me down and make me be his wife for eternity. Better the devil you know, which in my case was sharks and drunk teenagers. I suppose I thought dying in the ocean was just the cost of doing business, whereas dying in a lake meant you could only have been murdered by someone or something that derived erotic pleasure from your gurgled screams. He goes on to explain his ridiculous aquatic death belief system, but he then explains how he became an aquatic swimmer, and he started to embrace going into the ponds near him and around London, and it was what he did in order to escape the sadness of his son's near near death at that point. Um, he says, when our deaf Henry was sick and in the hospital, what Leah needed to do was swim, and many a morning she'd find her way to a nearby body of water for a quick dip. She had friends that did it, and she made more friends by doing it, all of whom seemed like lovely people. Insane, but lovely. Leah knew about my terror of the deep, but for some reason she didn't think it was worth countenancing in an adult man. So over many, many years, she'd invite me to come with her, and I'd conjure a malady whose only remedy was an immediate nap. When Henry was ill, I had far more excuses, but no energy to find the words to use them. So one autumn afternoon, we trundled off to Hampstead Heath, which has a ladies' and a men's pond, and brought our dear Henry and his favourite carer, Angela. Angela stayed with Henry while Leah and I sexually segregated ourselves and walked the short distance to our respective ponds. I took off my clothes in the outdoor changing area and put on my bathing suit. It was cool, maybe 10 degrees, but that didn't bother me. I walked purposefully out to the little pier that extended into the pond. It was a beautiful, bucolic scene to most. But I knew what evil awaited me in the water. I jumped in and then out so fast it probably looked like a tape played forward and then instantly backward at the same speed. Fuck this, I thought, as I towed off. I joined Henry and Angela, and we all waited in the banks of a different pond, while Leah swam leisurely, enjoying herself quite thoroughly. I, on the other hand, had narrowly escaped being eaten, or at least aggressively probed, by the amphibious zombie priest living in a barrel at the bottom of the men's pond. Never again, I vowed. But he did. And then he actually embraced cold water swimming, as so many of us do. And it often is a really great way to escape the way that we're feeling when we're feeling down. I wonder if any of you are cold water swimmers. I am a cold water swimmer, and I do love going for a lovely cold swim, even in the winter. Cam, great to see you. Are you a cold water swimmer? I wonder. You should let us know. So, Rob Delaney is the man of the moment in this amazing, very tragic, but brilliantly written and very funny book, which I actually think is a really great um, therapeutic book. Jane says that she's a cold water swimmer as well. Excellent, glad to hear it. I'm glad that there's some of you out there who are the nutters of the reading community like me who love to swim in the cold water. I wonder if you're in the sea or in a lake. I prefer a lake when possible, but it's not always easy to find them, or a river. Um, anyway, so Rob Delaney in this book writes very funnily about his life, and we get to know a lot about him. And the reason that I love the book is because he actually completely bears his soul to us constantly. And that's why I think it's such great bibliotherapy, because we completely get to know him. He's utterly shameless. He's constantly revealing home truths about himself and about his wife and about his family. And he divulges all and takes us with him on his journey of grief, which is just a really amazing thing to read all the time, making you laugh, which is incredible. So I'm going to read you a couple more bits. But Amanda is telling us that she likes to swim in the sea. I have a daughter who's a blue tit. What does that mean? You're going to have to explain. I feel like I ought to know. You're going to have to clarify. I'm assuming that it's a group of cold water swimmers. Um, I have some mad friends who live in our village who go swimming practically every morning, who are called the sea turtles, and they go down to Shoreham. I do occasionally join them, but if I can, I always go to a river just because it's kind of more mellow, like Jane. Um, anyway, I want to read you a bit about the sea, in which Rob is talking about going scuba diving, and I think he talks about death in a rather beautiful way here. Some months after Henry died, Leah and I took a scuba diving course to get certified. Leah had always wanted to do it, so I got us the classes as a Christmas present. The first few lessons were in a leisure centre in Soho. Funny that there are so many thousands of things happening mere feet from you in a city as big as London, and one of them is grieving parents learning to scuba dive in an old pool on the same street as theatres, pubs, and pret-a-manger's. When you learn to scuba dive, you do all the straightforward things you'd imagine. First, studying written material and then learning how all the equipment works and how to communicate with your partner. But you also practice situations for when things go wrong, from running out of oxygen to losing visibility if your mask is compromised for some reason. For that particular drill, we would sit at the bottom of the deep end of the pool with no masks on and our eyes closed for a few minutes, then ascend blindly to safety. Before we submerged, the instructor explained that it would be scary and we might want to freak out, or indeed might actually freak out. A couple of people in the class were visibly scared. I was not. I descended the 12 or so feet and sat on the bottom of the pool in darkness and felt lots of things, but none of them were fear. Mainly, I felt strongly that I was in a situation where if something went wrong, I could very, very quickly be with Henry, and that felt good. Obviously, there were others around me, and I was being observed by more than one instructor who presumably had incentives not to let their students die. But when we're underwater in blackness, we're some type of alone, whether we're being stared at or not. I consciously thought, I'm quite a bit closer to death 12 feet underwater and without sight than I was a few minutes ago. My son Henry did death and died not long ago. I won't take the regulator out of my mouth and inhale a lungful of water on purpose, but if it got knocked out by another flailing student and my own fin got caught on the drain and I panicked and inhaled and they couldn't revive me, well, then that would be okay. I felt like a lava lamp. The bits of plastic gloop bubbling around in me were actually bits of a dark sort of peace with death, a harmony with the knowledge that my son had died and that my own death would see me walk through a door he had walked through. We would share one more thing together, and that would be fucking great. So that is a really lovely sentiment of Rob's, and he does come back to that quite often through the book. And the book, as Amanda is mentioning, um, is both funny and serious, which I agree is incredibly clever in a writer and not easy to pull off. And Rob Delaney really does succeed. Um, I imagine it's probably an excellent book to listen to on audio. I haven't heard it on audio, but I'm assuming that he's going to read it. I bet he does. And surely that's going to be a great listen. But it is a really good read, and it's one that you can also reread because there's so much in it. There's a lot of pages that I wanted to mark and quote, one of which I don't think I'm going to be able to find right now, is about how Rob Delaney reads aloud with his wife which is something that I'm always trying to persuade people to do on a regular basis in any situation. And I think it's something that Rob has always done. It wasn't something that he started when Henry got incredibly sick. But he writes quite a lot about the books that he's read aloud with his wife in this, including one of my favourite books ever, which is The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber, which Rob Delaney and his wife read the whole thing aloud to each other, which is pretty impressive because it's really long. It's a book that, if you listen to on audio, is 36 hours. So to read aloud, it's going to take you almost a solid week of reading. Not really, but it's a long, long read aloud. And they clearly absolutely loved reading it aloud. And I do think it's a particularly brilliant one to read aloud because it's very much a book that takes you into an absolutely different world, which is the world of Victorian London, the world of a prostitute who is trying to escape from her very difficult and insanitary conditions in whatever way that she can. And it's an absolutely fabulous read if you haven't read it yet. Either read it to yourself or read it aloud if that's an option. Um, if you've got someone who's willing to listen and read it back to you as well over a long period of time, um, which isn't always easy to arrange, but it's a really great, lovely experience. Um, there's many things that Rob really made me laugh about. And actually, I'm going to come back to one of them, which is all about dogs. But continuing the theme of being distracted by art, Rob writes about that really brilliantly, talking about books that he's read aloud, but also TV and films. And he has quite a long chat in the middle of the book about how much he and his wife loved watching horror films after their son died, which seems really counterintuitive. But I'll read you the section about it because I found it really interesting. And as you can imagine, I'm always a massive fan of any kind of art therapy, even horror films. Leah and I watched a TV show called Devs after Henry died. I wonder if anyone watching has seen that. We did watch it during lockdown, and I did actually love it too. In it, Nick Offerman's character, Forrest, goes mad after his wife and daughter are killed in a car accident. He gets lost in his work, to say the least, and kills people when necessary to achieve his messianic professional goals. We loved the show and we loved how fucked up and horrible Forrest was. While we hadn't chosen the path of trying to reverse time and or create alternative digital realities in which Henry seemed alive like Forrest had, we looked at his behaviour and thought, hey buddy, if it works for you, to put a finer point on it, for us, watching a fictional character go crazy from grief feels like getting into a warm bath. Horror movies become incredibly important to me, and particularly Leah, sorry, became, when Henry was in the hospital. Early in his hospital days, we went to see 10 Cloverfield Lane in the cinema, which we quite enjoyed. Throughout the film, you're wondering whether the girl who wakes up in an underground bunker after a car accident is there because her captor is a psycho, or because, as he professes, an alien chemical attack has made Earth's air unbreathable. Leah and I laughed joyously when we found out both things were true during the film's climax. We were ecstatic. Everything was shit. Salvation was less than impossible, not only for the film's protagonist, but for the whole planet. And just like the film's protagonist, we were terrified as to which malady might kill Henry: cancer, an infection due to a chemo weakened immune system, or maybe his tracheotomy. You could do worse than 10 Cloverfield Lane for a pick me up while your kid's in hospital. The film Midsummer, which I couldn't watch personally, is modern history's finest example of the horror film as restorative phenomenon. Leah and I had the good fortune to see Midsummer in the cinema with our wonderful friend Clara. Clara's daughter Maud died of sepsis at age 3, 11 years ago. Her older sister discovered her dead in her cot on the morning of New Year's Day. I never met Maud, but in pictures she has big, beautiful cheeks that I would have kissed a few hundred times a day if she were my daughter. Clara and her husband, Jason, have been incredible friends to us in the wake of Henry's death. They get it. Nobody gets it, but they do. And we are far from the only bereaved parents they've helped over the years. He does talk about quite a few more horror films that he and his wife have watched and loved. And it's not something I can imagine turning to myself in times of tragedy. But being a bibliotherapist, I do get what he's talking about because I think any kind of catharsis and any kind of extreme emotion that you can escape into when you have gone through something terrible is going to be an escape, and perhaps the mad hysteria that he and his wife Leah went into when they were watching the horror films was incredibly cathartic, and that's why they loved it. And I wonder if horror books would have worked in the same way. I think they do for some people. Um, so going back to dogs, I wanted to talk about dogs because one of the things that I really loved about Rob was the way he's very rude about people and situations, and he's incredibly emotional in the way that he writes. He writes at the very beginning of the book about how he wants to attack people almost. I mean, obviously not really, but grab people and tell them about the awfulness of his grief. And he wants to make them imagine one of their own children dying. I mean, he knows he's very sympathetic when he's saying that, which I know sounds bizarre, but I think you can imagine that if you are in that situation, you want everyone else to feel the way you feel and to understand the way how utterly awful it is and how hideously unfair. And he also writes really beautifully about how much he loved Henry and how much he cuddled him. It's a very physical book. He talks about kissing his belly and stroking his hair, and it's just incredibly alive and vivid. And we completely feel when reading the book that we know Henry as well. So he really does evoke Henry incredibly memorably. I'm going to just read you this bit about the therapy dog that came to visit Henry. The biggest smile I've ever seen in my life was when a little therapy dog visited the paediatrics cancer ward at Great Ormond Street Hospital and came into Henry's room to play with him. I don't really like tiny dogs. I can get to know and respect individual small dogs, but as a concept, they generally bum me out. I guess it's okay because I know human beings have a hand in their breeding, and I believe that to be wrong. Let dogs fuck each other, or not, if you spay slash neuter them, and stay out of the way. Don't decide which dogs should fuck each other so that you can wind up with a litter of miserable, shivering little abominations that will fit in a cereal bowl when fully grown. I hope there's no tiny dog lovers watching at this moment. Plus, do you watch the dogs fuck each other and or assist them? Psychos! Do you punish them if they refuse? Anyway, it's clear my issue is with the dog breeders themselves, more than their cursed progeny, but I can't help but be reminded of their origin when I hear some yappy little shitbox barking at the heavens, knowing deep inside that God has forgotten about it. The dog who visited Henry was wonderful, however, and it forced me to confront deeply held prejudices, a practice I usually try to avoid. Well into his chemo treatment, Henry was weary, bored, and wanted to go home. One morning, a very sweet woman came to the door of his room and asked if he'd like to meet Lola, a little brown and white dog who liked kids. Yes, please, I said, and they came into the room. I detached whatever tubes or feeds I could and picked Henry up and sat him on my lap on the floor. I wanted to make sure he felt safe and was comfortable with the dog. He instantaneously wriggled out of my lap and onto the floor so he and Lola could kiss and hug. He was so happy. The paralysis on the left side of his face meant the intensity of the smile on the right side of his face was just off the charts. Your smile and my smile are more or less symmetrical, but since only half of Henry's face could smile, you could actually measure just how wildly different his happy to kiss and be kissed by Lola face was from his resting expression. When I look at pictures of the occasion, it almost looks like he's straining his face, like the amount of sheer joy was slightly too much for a human face to safely express. It was easily the most beautiful smile I've ever seen in my life. His little nappied bum sitting on the linoleum hospital floor, his legs splayed out with his little orthopedic black shoes, his smooth chemo fuzzy head, and the purest expression of joy you could imagine. Thank you, sweet Lola and Lola's friend, a wonderful volunteer who brought her in on her free time to meet kids dying of cancer. Whew, it's incredibly sad. It actually is a really difficult read. You will cry. There's no escaping it. But it is a book that is great to cry in. I think it is a book that really is a great read if you have lost someone, um, whether that is a parent or um, a sibling or any friend in your life, um, hopefully not a child. It because it's so beautifully expressed. He completely embraces his grief and tells you about it and has no shame or fear of talking about his grief. And that's why I love it so much. And I feel like it's a lovely short book, which kind of everyone should read. I feel like it's a really actually life embracing book, even though it is about the death of his son, because it's so intense about how much he loved his son. And I kind of don't want to give you too many gems from the book because I really want you to read it yourselves. But I do love the way he ends it. But I feel like maybe I shouldn't read you that because I don't want to spoil it for you. I want you to actually read it yourselves. So tonight's session is a short one, um, because I'm just talking about the one book and because it's been a really hectic day. Too much going on for me to delve deeply into various aspects of literature as I love to do. So next week, I'm going to be talking about long dark nights and the best books to fill those long dark nights with. I'm going to be talking on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook and Instagram page. So do join me there. And I would love to know, what are your favourite books to read on long dark nights? I feel like I love to read books that are set in big old country houses on a long dark night, probably because that's where I fantasize about being, preferably by a fire. But you might have completely different ideas, and I'd love to know what your favourite books for long dark nights are. They might be short books, they might be poems, they might be very modern and set in the present kind of books. I'm slightly feeling like historical novels could be what we're after. There's a couple of books I will just mention if I can bring them to hand, which I think I'm going to be talking about next week. So, The Whalebone Theatre. I think that's a great one for the long, dark nights. And also The Haunting Season, which I did talk about on my session that was all about ghosts, ghostly tales in literature. And this is a lovely one. It even says ghastly tales for long winter nights. So we can't resist that. And while I've got you here, I would just like to mention my fabulous fiction prescriptions pack of cards, which I will be talking about more over the coming weeks, which is a lovely box of bibliotherapy suggestions, which comes with various different categories: um, birth, childhood, school, coming of age, sex, dying, dreams and delusions. That's on one side. And on the other side, we've got love, excitement, desire, melancholia. And you can pull out a card and find a book relevant to any of those emotional situations. Um, so check that out. It's going to be the perfect Christmas prezi. Exactly as you say, Amanda. It's just waiting for all those Christmas stockings. Um, and just one last thought is that if anyone wants a bibliotherapy session, that's also a great Christmas present. So, looking forward to continuing with lots of other great book suggestions next week. Do let me know your thoughts for long, dark winter nights. I wonder if you've got any thoughts, Amanda. Um, and Natalie, anyone else that's out there, do send me in suggestions. You can send me suggestions either messaging on Instagram or email or on Twitter. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But thanks so much for joining me tonight. I hope you're enjoying the long, dark nights, even as they start with a howling wind. It's a perfect moment to be curling up on a lovely sofa with an excellent book. So, good night and see you soon. Thanks for joining me.